Well, friends, thanks so much for coming. Let me introduce a few ground rules of things that what's liable to happen. And Diana is the host or hostess, I don't know, host, I guess. And we'll be having some occasionally a breakout room or two, maybe, where you can get to know one another a bit, and I'll give you some stuff to think about and reflect upon. But I want to say a few things introductory wise about my relationship to the book of Job. I wrote a dissertation on Job in 1974. Diana had to type it, bless her heart. Remember typing? Some of you might remember that. Well before the days of computers, and she had to type it several times because when you change things, you know, you had to retype stuff and all that. It was terrible. And that dissertation finally appeared in 1975 when I finished a degree, and I still, I still think something of the dissertation, but I don't agree with much of it anymore. It's about 450 pages of single-spaced Hebrew stuff, and I think it's possible to read it like that, but that's not the way I hear the book any longer. And then in 1999, I wrote a book called Preaching Job, which was about using the book as a kind of homiletical preaching business. And there's more of what I think about it in there, but if I were to write it again, I would change it significantly. And I tell you all this simply to say that the book of Job is one of those books in the biblical story that it has many, many, many possible meanings. It's been used in multiple kinds of ways over the years by all kinds of people, politicians and ethicists and playwrights, and on it goes. It's a book that it just has a lot of interesting, complex things to deal with. And so we're going to do 6 weeks of this every Tuesday night, beginning tonight. And we are going to go through the whole thing. Obviously, we can't do the detail that it really requires to really get everything in it, but a lot of it I think we can certainly read it as a whole. And that's what I want to do. I want to read it as a whole. That's been an interesting question as well. We're going to say a bit more about that as I give a few introductory comments tonight about it. Well, first of all, nobody knows who wrote it at all. There's no indication of the writer. The rabbis early on thought it was Moses because it was so brilliant. They imagined that it was Moses because only Moses could write such a thing. That's highly unlikely, of course. Most people assume it's much later in Israel's history. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. The content is quite straightforward. If you've read it all the way through, it's 42 chapters long, which frankly is not all that long. Some of the chapters are not very lengthy. It starts in chapters 1 and 2, which we'll look at tonight, the so-called prologue. It's written in prose, not poetry. And then it moves into a long poetic section from chapters 3 through chapter 14, which is the so-called first cycle of speeches. Each cycle of speech follows the same pattern. Job speaks, one of the friends speaks, Job speaks, the other friend speaks, Job speaks, the other friend speaks. And that's the way the cycles supposedly go. It follows that way in the second cycle from chapters 15 through 22. And then the third cycle, beginning in chapter 23, falls apart for some reason, and nobody knows quite why. People that don't sound like the same writers are now saying things that we didn't imagine they would ever say. And there are Bible translations, for example, the Jerusalem Bible, which tries to tell you the way they think it ought to be. So they shift stuff around, moving chapter 26 over to chapter 23 and all kinds of stuff like that. But there's no indication of that at all. That's a scholarly creation. And then you get a very odd chapter 28, which is a so-called poem on wisdom. It doesn't seem to, it's supposedly in the mouth of Job, but it doesn't sound much like the Job that we've been listening to. Then you get a long speech of Job, 29 to 31. And Job at the end of that speech has a very sharp and angry call for God to appear. And lo and behold, God does not appear yet. There are 6 more chapters, chapters 32 to 37, where another friend, so-called, appears, named Elihu, who speaks long and windy speeches, not so different, I think, and we'll look at those a bit when we get to that in a few weeks. And then finally, God speaks, beginning in chapter 38. And God has 2 speeches. They're a total of about 72 verses long. Job responds to the first speech of God in a certain way in chapter 40. And then Job responds in a rather different way at the end of chapter 42, verses 1 to 6, very famous lines that we'll talk about when we get there. And then there is an epilogue to the book, chapter 42, verses 7 to 17, where Job receives double everything he had before and ends an old man, 140 years old, full of days and all that. So that's the book. That's the book that we have, and it is, frankly, the only book that we've got. We don't have any other example of the book of Job that's much different than that. Now, it is true that certain translations of the book, for example, the Greek Bible, the so-called Septuagint, is in some places rather longer. For example, when Job's wife appears in chapter 2 of the prologue, the Septuagint, the Greek version, has a much longer speech from Job's wife than we find in the Hebrew text. Why? Well, again, these are mysteries we just don't know. Let me give you one interesting story about a discovery of a text of the book of Job, which was found at Qumran in 1956, considerably after the original finds, by a French expedition in Cave 11. It wasn't a translation of Job, but it was what is known as a targum, that is an interpretation of Job. And you could then backdate the commentary to try to imagine and create what the text itself was saying. We don't have the text itself, just the commentary on the text. So we got to chapter 19, which is a very famous part of the book that Handel's Messiah made very famous in his oratorio, beginning in the third part of that oratorio. I know that my Redeemer liveth, reads the King James Version. And so it's a very hard text there. We'll talk about that when we get there in a few weeks. The reality is that when that scroll found at Qumran in 1956 was unrolled, and the scroll had been in a jar for almost 2,000 years, perhaps even a bit longer than that. So when you unroll a very old piece of parchment like that, it takes a long time. You soften it with oil and you move it millimeter by millimeter. When they got to chapter 19, that place that you would like to have known what was said by at least by somebody in the ancient world, there was a giant hole right there in the manuscript. So we weren't helped by that. Job is a very difficult Hebrew. It's the most difficult Hebrew in the Hebrew Bible. Even the Psalms are not as difficult as Job. That's for several reasons, apparently. It's almost like a dialect sometimes of Hebrew, a rather different reading. There are in the book of Job over 200 words, nouns, and verbs that only occur in this book. And so to try to imagine what these things mean is extremely difficult, as you might imagine. I would put it this way. About 10% of the Hebrew text of Job is practically unreadable. It's just a disaster. You're reading along and suddenly the quick brown fox jumped over the Gazornenplatt. It falls to pieces right before your eyes. And why that is, I don't know. I just don't know. we can read the book, of course. We can struggle with its essential meanings. It is, to me, one of the most important books in the tradition, but it has not, I think, been used in perhaps the way it needs to be used. Now, let me ask you this. Diane, you ready for a breakout room? I want you to, I don't know how many people will be involved in this, 4 or 5, is that what it is usually?
Yeah, we've got 25 or 26, I mean 51 or 52 people.
Okay.
And so I'm going to put 7 rooms. Does that sound good to you?
Yeah, that sounds fine. That's good.
Are
And
you
I
ready?
want you to introduce yourselves to one another if you don't know everybody, and you may not, as a matter of fact, know one another. Many from California, many from Texas, many from other places. So introduce yourselves. Here's the question. What, if somebody were to ask you, what is your relationship to the book of Job? What do you think the book of Job is about? How would you answer that question now? That's what I'd like you to struggle with for, let's say, 6 minutes. Dinah, can you do that?
You know, I'm not sure.
Well,
Well, it's life is an experiment.
Life is an experiment. So off you go to your rooms, and then we'll come back and I'll find a couple of you might say some things, and then we'll go on and talk about the prologue to give some idea of what I think at least the author is trying to do. Okay, off you go. Well, in my little group, we had some interesting comments that I won't repeat completely. I want you to keep these in mind, though, the ones that you heard and all that. We're going to have time at the end of every session around 8 o'clock to have some conversation, I hope, about some issues that were raised and that you have some questions. Remember, you also have the feature in the bottom of your screen, the chat feature. If you want to ask a question in the chat and you don't want to, you can do that too. So, but I want to have opportunities for us. But right now, I want to be sure we have time to raise the questions that I think the book is raising in the prologue. So here they are. Job is described to us in the first 3 verses of the prologue as an absolutely righteous person. The words that are used there to describe him, what does it say in English? Blameless and upright is usually translation. That's the NRSV anyway. I would translate those words absolutely righteous. Tam yashar in Hebrew. They mean that there is absolutely nothing wrong as Job presents himself in his society. He is the paragon of religious virtue. Now, not only is he the paragon of religious virtue, described to us by the storyteller in chapter 1, verse 1, but also he has, believe it or not, the right number of cattle and the right number of children, 7 sons, 3 daughters. 7, of course, is one of the magic numbers in the Bible about completeness. 3 and 7 are 10. That's another magic number in the Bible about completeness. He has 500 of these and 500 of that. Add that together, you've got 1,000. You've got 10 again. Every way publicly that you could possibly name, Job is absolutely a righteous human being. Now, I know those of us who are Christians who say, oh, well, nobody's right. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, says Romans, sure. But not here. The storyteller of this story presents to us a character who is absolutely, by all definitions, a righteous human being. Now, he goes so far as to say that Job's children, all 10 of them, have these festivals, these feasts, and the boys are wonderful. They invite the girls even to the feasts, and all of them get together and they have these marvelous parties. And after the parties are over, Job, fearful, it says in verse 5, that they may have inadvertently said something bad about God, even to themselves, he says. So he drags 10 screaming beasts into the temple after every one of these parties, sacrifices them up just to be sure that everything is okay. Now, here's the question I've got for you at this point. What kind of a God does Job believe in? I think, among many other things you could say, is Job believes in a God who must be taken care of, who must be, you must act appropriately all the time. It's a God who is always ready to do something to you if you don't. So hence the sacrifices, hence the right number of things, hence the right stuff, all of that business. Job is the greatest man of the East, it says, because he is rich and famous and comfortable and safe from the God who he believes, maybe deep down, is a God who is not always to be trusted if you're not perfect. So keep that in mind as the author writes, because things are going to happen now, and here they come. The camera of the story goes up into the sky, and there we meet God, Yahweh, the Hebrew God, and Yahweh has a court of gods, the children of the gods, they are called. And among the children of the gods is a figure who is called, and be careful now, the Satan. He is never called Satan, ever. He is called the Satan. Now that's very important, because this is not Mephistopheles, the guy with the horns and tail. This is not that guy. This is Ha-Satan, the Satan. Now, what does that mean? Well, there's been a huge argument about this over the centuries, about what the author had in mind about this. The first thing to be said about the Satan, he's a member of the divine court. He comes with the other children of the gods, and he is singled out by Yahweh, the head of the divine court. And Yahweh asks him a very interesting and important question. Where have you been? Oh, walking up and down on the earth, as I always do. It's my role, my job is to find out what human beings are doing and bring reports. He is a kind of, well, some people call him a spy. That may be a bit hard. Some people call him a prosecuting attorney. They may be closer to it. His role in the divine court is to report on what we human beings are about. And Yahweh says to him, well, okay, have you noticed my servant Job? Notice my servant Job. There is no one like him on the earth. He is a perfectly righteous man. God uses exactly the same phrase that we find in chapter 1, verse 1 by the storyteller. He shuns evil. He does everything exactly right. And the Satan asks the question that the prologue, I think, wants to raise. Well, of course he's perfect. Who wouldn't be perfect? You have hedged him round. You've made him safe and protected. I'll tell you what, if you took everything away that he had, he would curse you in your face. Now, this is where, if you take this, again, if you take this as more than a story, more than a narrative, and you begin to load the figure of God with all the other things that the Bible says about God, it seems to me you may be overdoing it a bit. Because according to this story, at least, God is a character in the story, just as the Satan is a character, just as Job is a character. And because God is a character in the story, God is very interested in the answer to the Satan's question. Very interested. He's got to find out. God must discover whether or not Job worships God for no reason. Now, this raises the question, I think, that the author first wants to raise in the book, and that is there a direct connection between piety and prosperity? Now, as we all know, in the 21st century, we've got a lot of preachers talking like that, don't we? The sort of If you're good, God loves you, and you're going to get rich. You're going to get a Cadillac. All you have to do is believe like we believe, and everything's going to be fine. That's the connection between a certain kind of belief and an automatic prosperity. So this is a story of 2,500 years ago, at least, and that question is being raised. It's a very important question. The way that I act, my behavior, does it automatically lead to my safety, my comfort, my goods, my success? That's the question of the book beginning. Now we should stop here a moment and ask the question. What's the author reacting against? Why would you raise this question? And I think probably the answer, again, it's a bit too simple to say it like this, but I will anyway. And that is, in the book of Deuteronomy, earlier in the tradition, probably from the 7th century BCE, what the author of Deuteronomy says is precisely that at various points. If you follow the laws, the Torah of Israel, you will live long in the land. The Deuteronomist says this over and over and over again. I would suggest to you that the author of the book of Job wonders very deeply about that. Is that right? If a person follows the Torah of God, does that person automatically receive good things? Is that the way the universe works? And then the second question that arises is precisely the question of the moral structure of the universe, the larger question. How does the universe work? Does it work in this, I do this and God responds? Or is it more random than that? Is it more mysterious than that? Is it more complex than that? This question, I think, is very, very lively in the time of the writing of the book of Job. Now, I'm going to tell you now when I think the book was written. There's no external evidence of what I'm about to say at all, because the book of Job doesn't mention a single thing from other traditions of the Hebrew Bible in terms of the history, the Exodus, the et cetera. It doesn't say anything about that at all. I would suggest, however, and there's some evidence of this, and we'll talk about it as we go through. I think it was written in the exile of Israel. Let me remind you of the exile briefly. Israel in the 6th century BCE was eventually surrounded by the Babylonians, who were the great power at the time. The Babylonians demanded in the year 597 that Israel pay tribute, and if they didn't pay tribute, they would be taken off to exile. Well, they paid. Nebuchadnezzar, the great king, warrior king of Babylon, put his own puppet on the throne, a man named Zedekiah, and imagined that things were just going to be fine now. Well, they weren't fine. Zedekiah was convinced by his courtiers to rebel against the great Babylonian Empire, which was a terrible mistake. And Nebuchadnezzar came back to Jerusalem 10 years later in 587. He was furious. And he surrounded the city. He starved them out. If Lamentations is right, they probably were eating one another. They had no food. They had a little water because of the pool of Siloam and all that. But they had no food. And so they eventually resorted to cannibalism to survive. But it was never enough. And they finally opened the gates of Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar and his armies poured in. They destroyed the temple, pulled it down to the bottom stones, which apparently some can be seen today. They destroyed the palace of the king. They took Zedekiah, the puppet of Nebuchadnezzar originally. They killed all of his children just before they blinded him. So the last thing he would ever see is the death of his own family. They dragged him and the court of Israel off to Babylon, 400 or so miles to the east. And they then lived in the city of Babylon for the next 2 generations, basically, the major leaders anyway. Now, the question became for Israel, because of this, this was the most important experience in their history, really. The question became for them, well, then what happened? Why are we in Babylon? Is it possible that we had something to do with that? And some people said, well, you need to read the prophets. They told you this. Amos, Isaiah, all of them said, if you don't pay attention to the poor and the widow and the stranger and the foreigner, you're going to lose everything. And they did. So many of those who went to Babylon were convinced the prophets were right, and they continued. It probably was in Babylon when the biblical tradition was put together. The Bible that we now know was probably put together then. But not all of them thought that. Some of them thought, well, maybe the Yahweh that we thought we worshiped was not the God we worshiped at all. Maybe this God was different. Maybe this God wasn't the kind of God who rewarded and punished people. That's what Job apparently says. And then there was the figure of Ecclesiastes, who wrote later than this for sure, but his ideas, I think, were probably abroad at the time. Look, everything is empty, he said. It's meaningless. There's no real meaning in life at all. It's just there's nothing new under the sun. The rivers flow into the sea, and the sea never fills up, and all things are weariness, and all is empty. So all of those ideas, I would suggest, like a great theological cauldron, were exploding in the exile. And then there was the figure of Isaiah. We call him second Isaiah, beginning in chapter 40 of the book, ending in chapter 55 of Isaiah, who gives us a vastly different way of thinking. His answer is this: Yahweh does absolutely everything, and you have no right to ask any questions of God at all. God does it all. Chapter 45, God creates weal and makes woe. God does everything, and you have no business asking questions. Job rejects that out of hand and says, in effect, oh no, that's exactly what you must do. You must ask questions. That's part of what it means to be a faithful person, is to ask questions. And there was then in the exile, I would suggest, a theological struggle, which was very real and very lively and very powerful. So this author creates what I would call a play, and it's a play of Job. Job is the hero of the story, or anti-hero, depending how you look at it. And eventually, Job responds to what the Satan does. You remember the Satan is given permission by God in chapter 1 to go down and take everything away. Job's family, Job's goods, Job's animals, Job's servants, everything is gone in a series of 4 disasters that follow. But Job's response, you remember, is quite extraordinary. What does he say? Some of you said it. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord has given, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. So the Satan is wrong, apparently. There is apparently no direct connection between traditional piety and possessions. Job demonstrates that that's probably not the case. But the story's not over. Chapter 2, it happens again. Up we go to the heavenly court, and this time exactly the same thing is said, but with one significant difference. Look at chapter 2, if you've got your Bible there. The Lord said to the Satan, where have you come from? Going to and fro on the earth, walking up and down on it, same thing that Satan says before. The Lord says to the Satan in verse 3, have you considered my servant Job? No one like him on the earth, blameless and upright, fears God, turns away from evil. That's all identical language to the first scene in chapter 1. He still persists in his integrity, it says, in my translation at least, in his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him for no reason. Boy, that's a scary phrase, isn't it? God suggests in this story that everything that happened to Job was in effect for nothing. It was for nicham is what it says in Hebrew, for no particular reason at all. And you lost because Job didn't curse me. See, he's down here blessing away. Well, the Satan's not done yet, though. He's got another line here. And the line he has is unfortunately not very clear. It's not easy to understand exactly what he says. I would argue that when he says in verse 4, skin for skin, all that a person has, they will give for their lives. I think what he probably means is that if you attack him personally, before, you remember, he wasn't attacked personally, it was just his goods and stuff. Now it's himself, his person. If you give him a terrible disease, I'll tell you, it'll push him over the edge. He'll curse you in your face. And so it's what happens. The Satan goes down and gives Job a monstrous disease from the crown of his head to the sole of his feet. Now, it's fascinating. There are PhD dissertations written to tell you what disease this is. It's ludicrous. We don't have any idea what kind of disease this is. It's the way to think about it, I think, is somewhere between Hansen's disease, leprosy, and the heartbreak of psoriasis, somewhere in there. It's a terribly unpleasant, disgusting, it breaks out. He'll describe later how it breaks out in pustules and all sorts of stuff. It's awful stuff. And he feels appalled. It's disgusting. It's a horrible disease. Not only now is he on an ash heap with nothing, but now he's got a broken piece of pottery that he's scraping his terrible pustules with. And then Job's wife comes to him. Now, this has always been a particularly a dangerous and terrible little scene. And early commentators, very early, I mean, like St. Augustine and Tertullian, the early church fathers, decided that Job's wife was, quote, an instrument of Satan, they said. She's just as terrible as Satan. Well, she's not necessarily. Listen to what she says. Do you still persist in your integrity? There's that word again. You're still holding on to the things you already believed. Are you still doing that? Why? What's the point? Look, curse God and die. Now ask yourself, if you're Job's wife, why would you say such a thing?
She's miserable.
She's lost everything. I mean, she's lost everything. Her life is in ruins. Everything she's had, all her safety, all of her comfort, all of her stuff has now been lost completely. And here's Job sitting on an ash heap with nothing, saying that God is taken away and God is blessed and blah, blah, blah. And she's had it. She's had enough. She's not going to take that anymore. This is not the words of the Satan necessarily. This is the word of a woman who has had her fill. And she urges him to go ahead. She can't stand it anymore, to watch her husband collapse before her eyes. Go ahead. It's obvious that God has got it in for you. I don't know why, but go ahead. Let God come and stop. Get this thing over with. I've had enough. Oh, no, says Job. You speak as one of the foolish women would speak, he says. Now, exactly what he means by that, it's hard to say. He certainly rejects in a way what she says, but now watch out what happens next. He does not repeat a phrase like naked I came, naked I shall return, but he asks a question. Shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not receive the bad? Shall we? And I would argue that at this point, Job's pious armor is beginning to crack. And when we read chapter 3 next week, you will see that it cracks. his conviction of phrases he's learned, things he said, finally have broken down. The reality of his life is now so appalling that the simple connections between piety and possessions clearly have failed. And now something else has to happen. Well, now three friends show up. And it tells us the three friends heard of all these troubles that had come upon him in chapter 2, verse 11. Each of them set out from his own home, Eliphaz the Temanite and Bildad the Shuhite and Zophar the Neamathite. Now we know nothing of any of these places. These names, a few of them, one or two of them are mentioned in other places in the biblical tradition, but we don't know anything about them at all. They all seem to have some relationship to an eastern part, east of what becomes the nation of Israel, in a place called Edom, which is across the Jordan River and to the south a bit. But that's all that we really know about any of this stuff. Watch now what happens. This is very interesting, the way this is written. They met together, verse 11, to go and console and comfort him. Their mission, they felt, was to join together as all three. They've known Job apparently for a long time. He's been a very famous man. And they want to go and comfort him. Something terrible's happened. And their intention when they go is to condole, to comfort him, to find comfort for him. But watch, verse 12. When they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him. And they raised their voices and wept aloud. Now that can be read in several ways. They saw him from a distance, and they didn't recognize him at all. The man they knew is no longer there. This man is on an ash heap with nothing. And they're not even probably sure it's even him. I guess they've been told it's him. They don't recognize him. They raise their voices and weep. Why? Well, people have often said that, well, they're trying to be empathetic with him. They're trying to indicate how much they care about his suffering and sorrow and all of that. Well, that's one way to hear it. Another way to hear it is when we finally discover about these friends what they believe, and they'll say this ad nauseum in the story, they believe that people end up on ash heaps because they are evil. And for Job to be absolutely bereft of his entire life on an ash heap, when they have a look at him, what do you suppose they think? Job has become evil, absolutely disgustingly evil, the worst man in the world. And so they stay away from him, it says. And watch what they do. They tear their robes. That's a typical mourning practice in the Middle East, for sure. That happens all over the biblical tradition. But now they do something which is very strange. They throw dust up in the air on their heads. That's not typical mourning practice. It is mourning practice to rub your hair with dirt, to rub it in there. You find that in various places in the biblical tradition, but not to throw it up in the air. There's only one other place in the entire Hebrew Bible where that happens. And the answer is it's in the book of Exodus, when during the plagues of Egypt, the 6th plague of Egypt, the dust from Egypt is thrown up in the air and comes down on the cattle and the people of Egypt to create boils. I might suggest this. They are throwing that dust up in the air as a sign of magic to protect themselves from the evil that Job has now received. They are not empathetic with him. They see him as a monster, and they are terrified of the monster. And then it says they sit with him on the ground for 7 days and 7 nights and say nothing. 7 days and 7 nights of absolute silence. That's a very long time for silence. What do they want to happen? And I think what they want is Job's death. They treat him as if he were dead already, and they're just waiting for the chance to watch him die. Because in their theology, you see, that's what happens to people who end up with nothing on ash heaps. They are worthy of death. That's their understanding. No one spoke a word. And so we end the prologue with the friends sitting around Job at a distance, throwing dust in the air, tearing their robes, absolute silence. Nobody says anything. And I think the answer is, the expectation is that nobody's going to say anything. It's going to be the end. This is it. Job is going to die, and that's the end of it. And that's what the friends hope. But surprise, surprise, Job is not going to be silent much longer. He's going to have a lot to say. And as a result of what he says, the friends are going to have a lot to say. And then the dialogue is joined, and the argument begins about the moral order of the universe. Who eventually is going to be right? How can we understand what God is doing? How can we appropriate the suffering of the universe? How does that fit in with an understanding of the nature of God? That's what the book of Job is about. And I would suggest, as I said earlier, that I think this is a play. I think it was originally designed as a play. I think it was staged in the exile as a way of describing to people these questions. What better way to get at these questions than to present them to people on a stage, to have them react, to see the way people react one to the other. In 1950 or thereabouts, Archibald MacLeish wrote a play called J.B. It was on Broadway for 18 months. It was a sellout, all 18 months. And apparently, I read some of the reports of the reactions to the play. People thought they'd been to church when they saw that play, and they left the theater in silence every single night. They didn't applaud. They left in silence. And I'm going to say some more about that when we get further on in the story. I think MacLeish completely misunderstood the book itself. He used the book as an entree to do something he wanted to do. But nonetheless, it was fascinating to me, the reaction that people had to that play. I've seen the play a couple times myself. It is a very interesting piece, but I don't think it really is what the book of Job is about, as fascinating as it really is. Okay, how are we doing on time? Oh, yes, good. We're just about right. That's fine. Now, Diana, are you still there?
Oh,
Diana?
yes, you just woke me up. I'm sorry.
Oh, I know, that's right. I want you to send people into the rooms again
Okay.
for 6 minutes or so. And I want you to ask the question in your groups. Introduce yourselves now if you don't know one another. In your groups, where do you think we are now in the story at the end of the prologue? Where are we now? And secondly, what do you expect to happen in this drama? Literature works on expectation usually. So where are we? What do you expect to have happen? Okay, so do that for 6 minutes, and then we'll have a little time after that to have a little conversation more. Okay.
Oh, just a quickie, John, from
Yeah.
Wayne. Is the book that you wrote in 1999 available?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, you can get it on Amazon. It's probably pretty cheap, I imagine.
For a couple of bucks?
A couple of bucks, maybe less. I don't know. It's called Preaching Job. It has a brief commentary on the whole book in it. So, you can get some flavor, at least, of what I thought about it 20 years ago or so.
Okay.
As I said, it's not quite what I think about it now. Close, but not quite. Yeah.
John,
Yep. Dick.
years ago, again, when I studied Job, I
Yep.
think our conclusion was that this was kind of like a play, all right, but that it was a play to bring people from the old ideas of God or gods
Mhm. Yep.
to the new idea that God doesn't cause everything that
Right.
happens.
You may be right. You may be right. That may be one of the answers we give when we get to the end. And certainly if you read the famous book by Rabbi Kushner, you know, Why Bad Things Happen to Good People, that was his conclusion. That is, God can do certain things, but God can't do everything. That was the title of one of the chapters, actually.
Well, he may be able to do it, but he doesn't want to.
That's right, or doesn't, for whatever reason. Exactly, yeah, sure.
Well, he gave it
That may
away.
be one of the responses we want to give, but as I say, it won't be the only response. There are plenty of other ones possible, as we will see, I trust. Okay, anybody else have any questions you want to raise at this point? We've got a few minutes.
I'm wondering if Reagan asked her question.
Reagan, okay, ask.
Oh, well, one of my questions was, I'm curious to know why you think the translations of our Bibles say Satan rather than the Satan.
Yeah.
Any idea?
Well, it's interesting, you know, I don't really understand exactly because I think it gives a false impression of what's going on here. Even in my New Revised Standard Version, this was a version that came out, remember, in the late 1980s. They have a footnote in the bottom of the page, which says, or, let's see, where is that? Oh, yes. Or the accuser, Hebrew, ha-satan. Now, I trust since none of you probably reads Hebrew, that's not very helpful, is it?
My Bible says the accuser.
Yeah, the accuser. Sometimes it's called, well, we'll talk about more because it's the word will come up again in the book later on. I don't really know quite why they keep doing that. It needs to be translated as the text gives it to us, the Satan. It is a title, not a name, if you will. You might put it that way, I suppose. Yeah. He's some kind of a divine figure, it says. And welcome in the heavenly court. I mean, he's not some kind of antagonist to Yahweh. He is a part of the heavenly court. The only other place that resembles this is in 1 Kings chapter 22. There's a prophet by the name of Micaiah ben Imlah who talks about a heavenly court of gods. It's pretty unusual to talk that way in the Hebrew Bible, but that's another place where it does.
Reagan has another question.
Okay, Reagan. Mhm.
What? I'm not raising my hand. Diana, what you doing to me?
I'm out of here.
I wanted to say something, Mike.
Yeah, please.
I have the New International Version,
Right, yeah.
and it also says Satan,
Yep.
but it's got some commentary for every page.
Yeah.
And it does down below, you know, say the accuser.
Yeah. Right.
So it does say the accuser.
Well, you know, even to translate the word the accuser is to give it a very heavy load of a translation, because accuser, of course, sounds very like an antagonist, doesn't it? Of God. And
Adversary is
that's
another
not what
word
this-
that's used.
What's the other-
Adversary.
Adversary, yeah.
Mhm.
Again, both of those words strike me as being pretty loaded as a kind of, and I'm not suggesting that Satan's a good fellow, but I am saying that in the story, he is performing the role he's asked to perform. And that is to bring news of what human beings are doing and to raise the important questions with God. And God is very, very mightily interested in the answers to those questions. Does Job worship God for no reason?
Well, I think Satan gets a bad rap because he does bad things.
Yeah,
You know, he's willing to do the bad, dirty work, and
that's right.
nobody wants to know that person.
That's right. Don't want to be called that, nonetheless. Certainly, his role, though, is part of the heavenly court. I mean, that's what his role is in this story, at least. Now, notice another thing about the Satan: he never occurs again. Completely drops out of the story. No talk about him at the end. No talk about him in the middle. None. He just gets the thing going and then disappears, which suggests to me that it's not the most important thing in the drama to worry about that. It's sort of like what Flip Wilson used to say, you know, the devil made me do it. Well, that's not what this is about. it's about something else entirely, I think. And what it's about is the complexity of God and how God operates in the moral universe that you and I live in. And that is a hard question. Always has been, always will be, I trust. Anybody else? Yeah, Shirley.
Twice, thus Satan asks God to smite Job, and God then gives permission for the Satan to do the dirty work. What does that tell us about the roles?
Well, what it does say, I think, the figure of God is not a very happy one here. There's no other way to say it. I mean, the figure of God in this story is a God who looks to be manipulated in some ways by the Satan's comments. I mean, what else can you say? But I would suggest that we hold that idea until we get to the end and see what God finally will say about all of this. And what God will say, as we will find out, is very strange and very mysterious indeed. And it may not satisfy us, but it certainly will give us a lot of stuff to think about, for sure, which I think is part of what the book is written for conversation, exactly like we're having. Okay, anybody else? Yeah, Nancy.
My turn? Okay, so back in Genesis, the fall was a way of explaining why there's evil in the world. Everything was perfect, and that there was evil, and they had to have an explanation, so they invented this one.
Right.
And we all know that Eve was framed.
Yep,
And-
right, was.
And this story seems to be, or the prologue at least, seems to be similar in that Job was perfect and everything was wonderful, and he had no sin, and yet bad things happened to him.
Yep.
So it's time for another story about why there's evil in the world.
Could very well be. That's not a bad way of thinking about it. Yeah. Certainly a theologian in the exile would want to raise that question by asking, by struggling with the question, why are we in exile? What happened to us? What did we do? Is there some connection between our behaviors and God's response? And for some people, yeah, the answer is yes, of course. Prophet said this already. For other people, it's not, is it that simple? And for this author, I think the answer is going to be no, it's not that simple. But you're probably right. That's certainly what may lie in the background of this is the question, the issue, do we have to have another kind of explanation about the origin of the bad things in the world? And maybe we do. Maybe we do. Maybe the original one's not going to do us anymore. Maybe. Yep. Okay, anybody else? Can't see anybody.
I do have a question.
Good,
And
okay.
that is, I just need to hear from everybody. Were you in the same groups both times?
Yes.
Was
Yes.
that good? Did you like that? Or would you prefer being in, oh, Reagan liked it. Who didn't? Thumbs down. Oh, everybody liked it. Okay, cool,
Not
cool.
everyone.
Not everybody. Oh,
Not
Phil
everybody,
didn't
no.
like it.
No, I expected, no, I didn't, not that I didn't like it. I expected a diversity.
Yeah,
of
right,
views.
right.
But that's because I'm not Sabrina, Phil.
Well,
Diana's doing this for the first time, so.
One more comment.
as much fun as that was, next week, different groups.
Yeah.
Okay.
The same group, for both times.
Yeah.
But different each week.
Yeah, we'll figure it out, right.
Oh, well, maybe we will. We'll work on it.
Yeah.
I think you did great.
Given that, we think this was written during the exile and,
Yeah.
they wondered, was there some connection between their behavior and being in exile? Well, this is another time. We're in pandemic.
Yeah,
And
sure, we are.
This is the punishment. It's
Exactly.
the same issue again.
There you are. Yeah, I think the play could work right now, couldn't it? To raise that question. Why are we in pandemic? What did we do? And for some people, there will be certain kinds of answers for that. And they've been giving answers like over the last 14 months. Sure. Right. And that's a good analogy, I think, because that's what this thing is trying to do. It's trying to raise the question about how do we answer this conundrum about being in exile? What did we do? What happened? I think that's right. I like that. Yeah, I do. Okay, let me say for next time, next Tuesday night, same time, same station, we will be doing chapters 3 through 7. 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. This is Job's initial speech, which is really quite extraordinary, as we will see. And then Eliphaz, the first friend, will give a long speech in chapters 4 and 5, and Job will respond in chapters 6 and 7. So that will give us a kind of beginning flavor of how the dialogue works, and then we will proceed from there. So next week, if you have time between now and then to read chapters 3 through 7, I think you'll be ahead of the game a bit, okay? So thank you very much for being here. Let's conclude with a word of prayer, and then we'll be dismissed for this evening. Oh God, we are so grateful for this magnificent book, which has energized and challenged and amazed people for so many centuries. We are grateful for it, but most of all, we are grateful for your presence among us as we struggle with it, as we think through it, as we share ideas about it. Thank you so much for the freedom and opportunities to do precisely that. And in those ways, we will praise and bless your holy name. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks.
Amen.
See you next week, I hope.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Bye.
My pleasure. Bye-bye all.
Bye.
Back.